People often refer to slavery as being America's original sin. And I understand like where people are coming from when they say this, but I do think it's wrong, and I think it's very fundamentally wrong. And the reason why is because capitalism is America's original sin, and slavery is necessary for capitalism to function. Slavery is just a component of capitalism. And so it's not, to say that, oh, capitalism just as a philosophy is so much worse than slavery. It's just to say that slavery is a necessary component of capitalism. Along with everything else that's bad about capitalism, you have slavery. And I mean, you can prove this throughout the entire history of the country. I mean, take the Civil War. The Civil War was on its surface about slavery. And I'm not about ready to tell you it was about states' rights, I promise, because that's complete bullshit. But it was just at its surface about slavery. The reality of what it was at its core was about capitalism. What it comes down to is competing economic models, the northern model of capitalism and the southern model of capitalism. The southern model with the plantations and the oligarchic planter class and forced chattel slavery, and wealth being tied to land and the need to expand across the rest of the continent and expand slavery to those states for that purpose, for continuing to grow that system, right? And in the North, it's the same thing. It's a different economic model, also capitalist, but this one's industrial. This one requires that you have a consumer class. This one requires that you be able to have workers who are paid wages, but albeit very low wages. But slaves, the people who are enslaved, drive down wages, and it drives down the existence of a consumer class. And these two systems are at odds with each other. And that's why between the Democrats and the Republicans and the Whigs, the fight was about expanding slavery to the rest of the continent. It wasn't about abolishing slavery. And when Lincoln got elected, he wasn't going to abolish slavery. He was just going to stop it from expanding. But in the South, they knew that that would kill the system ultimately. If you don't have an expanding and growing number of states and of plantations and like a constantly growing a growth model of capitalism, which probably is very familiar to people today, this constant need for growth, you get stagnation and ultimately it collapses in on itself. And they knew that. They knew that if they lost control of Congress and of the Senate and of the political apparatus of the United States, ultimately their system would stagnate and die. And same thing with the North. The North knew that if they lost control of the Senate and more states were brought in as slave states, and they lost their ability to set tariffs and to set trade policy and to set, the creation of a federal bank and of markets and all these things, all this industrialist stuff that we're all very familiar with today as well. If they lost the ability to control that kind of system and to set that kind of policy, their economic model would die too. And so it ended up being a war about slavery at its surface, but at its core, it was two competing types of capitalism fighting with one another. And it's part of the reason why, when the war ultimately ended and you did have emancipation, there are exceptions to the 13th Amendment, specifically around being able to use forced labor still, if it's from incarcerated people. And then you end up with, the 20th century and the late 19th century with mass incarceration and all the evils of Jim Crow and segregation and all these things. Those are often taught as being social structures, right? Ways of preserving white supremacy. But they were also, and I would say more so, about controlling labor and controlling class and stopping unionization and mass labor organizing and of keeping wealth in the hands of the people who had it. Part of the reason why Reconstruction was ended. Reconstruction was ended by liberal Republicans who were interested in stability and preserving the economic status quo. It wasn't about the social, hierarchies inherent in white supremacy. It was about maintaining the status quo and maintaining wealth and stability and, reestablishing trade and reestablishing the constant inflows of money. And so today, we still have slavery. It's a necessary component of capitalism. It will not go away unless you get rid of capitalism. It's just that slavery it has different names now, and it's baked into our globalist system. So, slavery is not visible to us in the imperial core, but out in the global south, slavery is very much alive, and they see it every day. And it's how we end up with our, minerals for our, electronics and our cell phones. It's how we end up with all these cheap consumer goods and clothes and things like that. Extractive, things like mining, those are all just rife with slavery. Same thing with agriculture in a lot of these places. The slavery continues out in the global south, and it is directly in our supply chains. And then you still have forced labor here in the United States and in the imperial core and other places, like in Europe, where you're dealing with just economic precarity. If you don't go and work, and if you don't, provide your labor to a capitalist in order to feed yourself and get health care and housing, etc., you die. There's not really a choice. And so, like, these systems require cheap and forced labor in order to operate. And so a system and a nation that is built on capitalism in the way that the United States is built on that original sin. And if you do not get rid of capitalism, and if you don't destroy capitalism, you will always have slavery. Slavery did not go away. So that's why I think capitalism is the original sin. Not because slavery is not fucking horrific, but because without capitalism, you don't have slavery. And that's why you get these kind of arguments too from chuds on the right, where they're like, well, other countries did, had slavery all throughout human history. There's always been slavery. But American slavery is different. And American slavery, everyone, who's being honest with themselves knows how different American slavery is. Chattel slavery was different for a lot of reasons. And the main reason, though, is that it turned human beings into capital, into private property, and made that a sustainable private property that was passed on from mother to child and was passed on as generational wealth from enslaver to enslaver. It was this economic model that was added to slavery that was uniquely American, capitalism, this capitalist economic model that was added to, yes, a practice that has existed through most of human history, that made it so much different and so much more disgusting. And so it's like one of my issues with the 1619 Project too, because I did fantastic work in the 1619 Project, but I think in a lot of ways they do things a little bit backwards in that they tie slavery to the capitalism that we have today and help you to understand the ways in which slavery influenced the life that you have now and under this capitalism that we have now. But I think the reality is the reason why those things are so similar is because slavery was shaped by the needs of capitalism. And so you can see those through lines, and the reason why so much of life in plantation South and in enslavement in the South has so many through lines to life in capitalism today is because it's all feeding the same interests of the same people. I've talked about this before in some of those videos I did about Thomas Jefferson. Very few white people in the South actually owned slaves. The majority of them, if not virtually all of them, benefited from slavery in one way or another. But it was a very small number of them who actually owned other people. And it was an even smaller number, very similar to the number of ultra wealthy that we have today, who owned more than 100 slaves. That was your billionaire class. That was your Epstein class of wealthy people, were these people who owned 100 or more slaves. And often those people owned thousands of slaves. And that was the ultra wealthy, ultra rich class of people in slave owning society. And those through lines continue to exist today. And so I often think there were the successes of the Civil War and that black people were freed from chattel slavery. But as black people know, it doesn't mean that they were freed from slavery just entirely, right? And it doesn't mean that they just were freed from bondage and life was great after that. But I think also it's important to note that the Civil War wasn't necessarily successful because the same class of people, the same system, was allowed to go on to today. We have the exact same mechanisms that created chattel slavery in effect today. And so when you look at slavery and say that it's like an aberration, that it's this evil thing that marred the early republic, the early United States, that it was its original sin, I think you run the risk of missing the fact that it wasn't this aberration, it wasn't this grotesque thing that ruined an otherwise good project. It was a feature, and one of the strongest features of the system that was established. And the system that brought us chattel slavery in the United States is the same system that we all are living under today, and that can bring chattel slavery back. Everything that you think of as progress that we've made in this country, it's all tenuous, and it all can be taken away like that, unless you get rid of capitalism, unless you get rid of the base system on which everything has been built. There is no progress under capitalism. Nothing gets better in a structural or in a sustainable way. It's all tenuous, and it all can be taken away so much more quickly than you realize. Because the core, the foundation of the very system that we live in, that is the wellspring from which all the rest of this evil grows. And if you don't do something about that, then everything else that you're building is just a house of cards.